Hello, my name is Brent Hunt. My channel is Discerning What Is True. I am live today on Facebook, also on Odyssey, and also on YouTube with my channel name again, Discerning What Is True. Today is the 14th day of March 2023, and what I'm going to be reading to you today is from a book by Eustace Mullins, The Rape of Justice. This will be chapter 9, that is. So I'm wishing you all a good day and wishing you also to have ears to hear and eyes to see. I will be reading soon this particular book by Eustace Mullins, The Curse of Canaan. And I also will be reading a particular book called Other Losses, which tells what happened after the war with Germany. And the truth is, we're not such a good country after all, folks. This guy, a writer, wrote these books, and what really transpired after the Germans gave up. And we're not obeying the Geneva Conventions at all. That took place even with George Bush when the Iraqis actually surrendered and we actually killed them all. Getting a little tired of it, aren't you? Getting tired of what I call hypocrites in office. These people need to go. So, again, we'll be getting into those books, but this one is the one right now I want to go through and explain to you what's going on. Okay, so most of you know that I actually read from Eustace Mullins from his books because it's important that you, because most people can't afford what I would call tons and tons of books, and they have other priorities. They have their family, they're married, whatever it is, they don't have the time. So this is for those who have the ears to hear again and eyes to see. The name of the chapter is called The Case of the Strange Director. On April 25th, 1973, the present writer, that is, Eustace Mullins, filed in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., a $3 million lawsuit for damages against the estate of J. Edward Hoover, the late director of the FBI. Within hours after the report of this lawsuit went out over the National Wire Service, L. Patrick Gray III, acting director for the FBI, who had aspired to become Hoover's successor in power, hastily withdrew his name as a candidate. Already under fire for having burned stacks of documents from FBI files, Gray feared that he would be summoned to testify during the Mullins suit. He decamped from the Washington scene, I should say. I initially filed the suit in Superior Court in Washington, D.C., but the court informed me that they had a limit of $50,000 on damage suits. I had to file a precip dismissing my own case and refile it in the U.S. District Court. Although I was suing the private state of a U.S. citizen, the case was defended by Harold H. Titus, the famed U.S. prosecutor of the Watergate trials. Presiding over my suit was Judge Sirico, also Watergate fame. I protest the involvement of the Department of Justice filing a memorandum to cease and desist on the grounds that one party should not hire the counsel from the opposing party. I was paying for my prosecution, you see, of this action as the plaintiff, as an attorney of record. But the estate of J. Edward Hoover, which consisted of the persons of Hoover's consort, Clyde Tolson, was defended by the Department of Justice, the world's largest law firm, employing 5,000 lawyers and with 72,000 employees to back up the lawyers. The problem was that as a taxpayer, I was paying taxes to support the operation of the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice was supplying a lawyer for my opponent. The 5,000 lawyers at the Department of Justice had a long history of incompetence when handling cases because they are generally dominated by a small band of traitors known as Nesher, N-E-S-H-E-R, the Hebrew word for eagle. When Nesher called for the prosecution of some Americans for a alleged offense against the international Zionist movement, the Department of Justice was marvelously efficient, totally relentless, and avid in the pursuit of a conviction. However, On other cases, they have a long record of bungling, muffs, and general ineptitude. This is known by the files, I should say, of my case. Councilor Titus filed a memorandum to the court noting that on November 6, 1973, defendant counsel discovered that a motion to dismiss had never been filed, although one was prepared for filing on July 26, 1973. Counsel then requested that the motion to dismiss be considered timely filed. So this was a civil action. It was the Eustace C. Mullins, the plaintiff, and the estate of J. Edward Hoover, defendant. Civil action number 779-73. The memorandum to the court. On November 6, 1973, defendant counsel principally assigned to defend this action checked the clerk's office docket entries as well as the court file to ascertain whether the court had taken any action with respect to the defendant's motion to dismiss. Upon checking the official records, it appears that a motion to dismiss had never been officially filed, although one was prepared for filing on July 26, 1973. Defendant counsels believe the motion was filed in the regular course of business on that day. And no further action was taken by counsel pending a response or of a deposition, I should say, by the court. Attached is a court of defendant's motion, which had been part of defendant's file since July 26, 1973. Defendants respectfully request that the attached copy of the motion to dismiss be considered timely filed. And we have Harold H. Titus, Jr., U.S. Attorney. Titus didn't retire from the Department of Justice on grounds of nausea. Other members of the 5,000 Department of Justice lawyers arraigned against me continued their defense of the case. The result was that without any court argument or any court appearance of the defendant, U.S. District Court Judge Joseph Waddy, W-A-D-D-Y, dismissed the case on December 10, 1973. There has been no adjudication, no hearing of any evidence in the case, and no consideration of my constitutional rights. This is the way it's done, folks. They protect those who actually are doing evil. Okay? You got to understand what the stack is against you. And this is why I'm reading this stuff, basically to make you aware of this. And Eustace Mullins was also trying to warn people. This is over 50 years ago, folks. The decision was rendered almost 50 years ago. The decision was rendered according to the law merchant as an equity decision by a United States judge on behalf of the United States, as Judge Wadley mentions in his dismissal, the opposition filed by the United States. I have not brought suit against the United States as a citizen of the United States. I would be suing myself. The prejudice shown by Judge Wadley against me was not because he was a black and I was white, although this may have played a role. The prejudice was based on the grounds that I was a middle-of-the-road American citizen. And Judge Wadley had gone on record that he favored liberal or left-wing activists. When a number of rioters had been taking off the street in Washington to protect American citizens and their lives and property, Judge Wadley had awarded them enormous sums of money as gifts from the government of the United States for the inconvenience they claimed to have suffered by being detained. Judge Wadley did not wish to hear the evidence of harassment and surveillance I and members of my family had suffered at the hands of government agents for some 33 years. Harassment which was documented by official government reports and which would have been submitted to the court had I been allowed to present any evidence in the case. Prejudice prevented me from prosecuting this claim for damages, although damages were freely bestowed by the same judge on rioters who presented a clear and present danger to the people of the United States. The stage was set for the actions which precipitated this lawsuit when Congress created the Department of Justice on June 22, 1870. Interesting. Providing for a national justice system and a federal attorney general. In 1908, the answer to inaudible demands from the American people for a team of national investigators, Congress included in the Sundry Civil Appropriated Bill for 1909 the funds to establish a Bureau of Investigation. The force behind this demand was a small band of Jacobins, or Masonic Canaanites, who wished to establish a national political police based upon European models. These political police were intended to implement programs designed and enacted by insidious international conspirators to enslave and rob the people of the United States. These political police were intended to punish opponents of these censors Senator program. See, this is over 100 years ago, folks. Are you aware of this? I doubt you are. To enslave and rob the people of the United States. The then Attorney General Charles Joseph Bonaparte, a member of the family of Napoleon, warned Congress during the deliberations and testimony on this appropriation that it presented a very real danger of setting up agent provocateurs in the investigative branch of the Department of Justice. Bonaparte showed remarkable foresight in 1908. The Bureau of Investigation, renamed the Federal Bureau of FBI in 1935, became a nest of agent provocateurs under the leadership of J. Edward Hoover, whose philosophy of fighting crime was to ignore it, as political goals were all that mattered. His agents soon realized that they were expected to find something to investigate on the political realm, and if there was nothing in this vein, it was their mission to create it, to plan it, to finance it, and to instigate it. The FBI became the BAP, that is the Bureau of Agent Provocateurs. In March 1909, the new Bureau of Investigation began in operations under Bonaparte's successor as Attorney General George Wickersham, a wealthy Wall Street lawyer and law partner of the President William Howard Taft. You remember William Howard Taft was the president 1 year for 4 years and was successful and basically thought he was going to run. He ran again, and he ran against Woodrow Wilson, and he ran against Theodore Roosevelt. And Howard Taft finished third, even though he was the incumbent. So he wasn't squeaky clean, neither was he. The Bureau was still a modest operation with only a few agents when a young deck attendant from the Library of Congress joined in 1917, apparently to dodge the draft. J. Edward Hoover had worked on the decks at the Library of Congress for some years, attending Georgetown Law School at night. After he had completed his studies and qualified for the bar, he had the requisite qualification to become an agent for the Bureau. In this position, he was also classified as a vital government employee and was removed from the list of young men who were being drafted into the armed forces of the United States. At the conclusion of the First World War, J. Edward Hoover became a flunky, you see, in the national anti-communist crusade inspired by Attorney General Harry Daugherty and implemented by the chief of the Bureau of Investigation, William J. Burns, who served as director from 1917 until 1924. Burns was the most able and most famous detective in the United States. He came from a family which had long been distinguished in the profession of law enforcement. His father had been police commissioner of a scandal-ridden city, that is Columbus, Ohio. That's not changed neither, folks. That's interesting. Where he finally sent many prominent officials to prison. William Burns himself, at the age of 24, had exposed the election frauds of 1883. He made his national repetition by cleaning up graft in San Francisco, where he sent many corrupt officers to jail. He solved the Times building bombing of 1910, an act of terrorism which killed 20 people. It was Burns' brilliant detective work which sent the McNamara brothers to prison for this act of wanted terrorism. Burns then joined the U.S. Secret Service, which he uncovered a national counterfeiting ring which had been operating unmolested for some 25 years. In New York City, Burns made headlines again when he solved the murder of the notorious gambler Herman Rosenthal, which culminated in a police lieutenant and 4 gunmen being sent to the electric chair. At the conclusion of the First World War, Burns was enlisted by Attorney General Daugherty to lead the battle against revolution in the United States. The communists, exulting in their headly victory over the Tsar in Russia and the bloody massacre of his entire family, saw the United States as ripe for the Bolshevik takeover. Their goal was to break down the orderly process of government on every level and to take advantage of the resulting confusion and demoralization of the people by instigating a national Bolshevik takeover. On June 2, 1919, during this battle, the home of General Mitchell Palmer at 2132 R Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., a peaceful neighborhood of government officials, was blown up. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt, who lived across the street, found bits of the bomber's body on his doorstep. This bombing was intended as an act of retaliation for the famous Palmer raids, in which hundreds of wild-eyed communist revolutionaries, most of whom were illegal aliens, had been arrested. Congress, even as today, was pronounced in its sympathy for the revolutionaries. In a concerned counterattack against the campaign of the Attorney General, the House Rules Committee summoned Palmer to a formal hearing where hostile members of Congress denounced him for his actions against the revolutionaries. They demanded that the rights of the aliens be protected. Those who believed that Congress is only concerned with the problems of communism saw the demonstrative proof of their beliefs in the Moscow show trial, which Congress recently staged featuring Oliver North. However, they had no knowledge of the fact that Congress had been relentlessly in defense of Bolshevism since 1920. As a junior assistant to Director Burns, J. Edward Hoover participated in the Palmer raids. This activity enabled him to pose for the rest of his life as a militant anti-communist, in fact. Hoover proved to be the Trojan horse in Burns' Bureau of Investigation, you see. He had become the well-known protege of a prominent liberal in the Wall Street plot to destroy not only the anti-communist campaign, but President Harding's entire administration. This campaign culminated in the strange death of President Harding, that is, the suicide of prominent figures in his administration, and convictions of others, including Attorney General Harry Daugherty, and on various charges, sending them to prison. It was a classic demonstration of a Democratic Congress impeaching a Republican administration and trying its officials on congressional charges. Thomas Jefferson's principle of checks and balances, the three departments of government having equal power, was thrown into the wastebasket. Again and again, we have seen this same technique. This resulted in the removal of a Republican president, Richard Nixon, from office, and the imprisonment of his principal advisors and the conviction and imprisonment of most of Ronald Reagan's closest advisors. All of these convictions were obtained by the spectacle of a typical Moscow show trial, which were made world famous by the bloodthirsty dictator Joseph Stalin in Moscow in 1938. Congress learned the technique well. After Daugherty had been charged, he was replaced by a well-known liberal named Harlan Stone, who also happened to be the mentor of J. Edward Hoover. The two had been the subject of ribald discussions for some months about the omnipresent Washington Gospels. As an astute detector, Burns was aware that Stone might be subject to blackmail, but he was resolved to ignore the situation, you see. He was stunned when Stone, as his first officer first act as Attorney General, notified him that the entire anti-communist campaign of the government was now abolished. Stone dismantled the GID, the General Intelligence Division, which had been the backbone of the national drive against the communist revolutionaries. When Burns requested that he be given several weeks to wind up the work of GID, Stone called him into the office. This was the provocation he had been writing for. He informed Burns that he was fired as director of the Bureau as of that moment. The audacity of this action, suddenly discharging the nation from its able detector, was typical of the arrogance of the left-wing bureaucrat. Stone replaced Burns with J. Edward Hoover. At one stroke, a dewy-eyed young man of 24, wistful and demure, had become one of the most powerful bureaucrats in Washington, a position he was to hold for the rest of his life. Most people don't know this, folks. They don't. Continue. Burns went to some of his powerful friends in Washington, complaining that Hoover had come in by the back door. But he discovered that a former officer, he no longer had any clout. He never again worked for the government, founding his own very successful private detective agent, which endures to this day. With Burns out of the way, Stone proceeded to enlist the entire Department of Justice in a massive frontal attack against members of the Harding administration. This campaign was not only intended to punish the Harding officials for their prosecution of national anti-communist campaign, it also had a deeper and perhaps more vital purpose in staging a massive cover-up of a number of billion-dollar swindles which had been perpetrated as national emergencies during the First World War. The principal benefactor of this cover-up was the Standard Oil industry. Rockefeller had double-billed the military forces for billions of dollars in oil and other vital military supplies throughout the war. This is a natural phenomenon, folks. It happens all the time. Nothing like American business. Investigating of U.S. Food Administrator Herbert Hoover was also underway to trace the black market activities of his officials in sugar and other foodstuffs. The second in charge of his administration of the Food Administration had been Louis Lichtenstein, Strauss, that is, who then became partner of the Wall Street banker house of Kuhn, Lowe and Company, the American representative of the Rothschild interests. Hoover himself had been a Rothschild agent for years, serving as director of Rio Tinto Zinc. That's RIOTINTO Zinc, one of the three firms on which the Rothschilds' fortunes were based. There were also impending inquiries into the disposition of funds raised by the Belgian Relief Commission, which Hoover had headed for several years and whose improprieties later became the subject of a number of books, among them The Strange Life and Career of Herbert Hoover. The investigation was scheduled of the activities of Eugene Meyer, a partner of Bernard Baruch, head of the War Financial Corporation, whose administration had printed billions of dollars worth of Liberty bonds in duplicate. One duplicate been sold to the public, and the other as asset to the Meyer fortune, which would later enable him to purchase the Washington Post. Now, these guys don't miss it, do they? Today, most influential political newspaper in the United States. There were also calls for investigating the activities of Bernard Baruch, who had served as head of the War Industrial Board, whose stock speculations in the U.S. steel and other munitions firms had made him one of the wealthiest men in the United States. All of these investigations vanished into oblivion. As the nation's press indulged in an unequal orgy of media hype about a real scandal, the Teapot Dome oil operation, today many Americans exhibit a knee-jerk reaction when asked about the Teapot Dome, but they show no reaction to inquiries about the Roosevelt scandals, the Hoover scandals, the Meyer scandals, or the Baruch scandals, probably because they don't know. These were all shoved under the rug, which while the attention of the nation was focused for the next 8 years on the Teapot Dome scandal. During all of this hype, the real story was completely submerged. Two competitors of the Rockefeller oil industry, Harry Sinclair and Edward L. Donaghy, had been persuaded by Washington bureaucrats to engage in an act of public service. They were asked as a patriotic effort to pump out a national oil reserve at Teapot Dome because geologists had warned that the oil was slowly sinking into the sandy substratum and would soon be lost forever. Although Sinclair and Donaghy were skeptical that they could afford such a gesture of public service, they were finally persuaded to proceed. They formed the Mammoth Oil Corporation, that's spelled MAMMOTH, and leased Teapot Dome for the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, whose name as a result of this episode entered the language as a fall guy or patsy, also inspiring the colloquial phrase to take a fall. On the advice of his Department of Oil experts, Fall routinely approved the lease. At the time, Fall owned the largest ranch in the United States. It was called Tres Rios in New Mexico, some 750,000 acres, an area that is 55 miles long and 24 miles wide. Acting on secret instructions from Washington, New Mexico, tax officials suddenly doubled the taxes on his ranch, an amount he was unable to pay. Faced with the loss of his holdings, Fall requested Sinclair for a temporary loan to pay the taxes, which Sinclair agreed to do. The Rockefellers then sent one of their most unsavory henchmen, John Leo Stack, on a secret mission to the nation's most unsavory newspaper publisher. Frederick Von Fitz, owner of the Denver Post. Von Fitz had become a newspaper publisher by a circuitous route. He had operated a lottery in Kansas City where the ticket purchasers learned that there would be no winning tickets. Bonnefield Harry left town ahead of the lynch mob. With his profits, Bonnefield arrived in Denver where he found that the local newspaper, the Post, could be had for cash. He bought it at an ideal investment for a new and even more profitable operation than his fake lottery. The Post became his personal vehicle for ludicrous blackmail operations. He would make up a dummy front page involving some local luminary in a scandal. The scandals were already real, even though the page was a fake, and sent it to the victim, noting that a suitable donation, usually $5,000 or $10,000, would stop the presses. The victim always paid up. Stack brought Boniface an even more attractive offer. He promised Boniface a cash payment of $200,000 to print the story of Teapot Dome. The account as a Rockefeller operation presented it as a terrible national scandal. the looting of national oil reserves by unscrupulous profiteers. Other editors had already turned down Stack. Despite the lucrative offer, because the story was obviously phony and could result in expensive libel suits, Boniface accepted the bribe without a second thought and wrote the story of the scandal. Once he had printed it, other editors were willing to take their chances. At any rate, Sinclair and Dohoney had no opportunity to sue anybody because they were soon victims of the entire legal staff of the Department of Justice. Boniface later complained that Stack had withheld $40,000 of bribe money. Stack claimed that this was his commission for acting as a bagman for the Rockefellers. Boniface finally dropped his complaint, perhaps on the commitment from the Rockefellers to bring him even more lucrative deals in the future. The Dictionary of National Biography provided further insights into the swindles perpetrated by Boniface and his longtime partner, Harry Tammen, Tammen. They are memorialized by the historical F.L. Mott, M-O-T-T, in his American Journalism, A History of Newspapers in the U.S. through 250 years. As paternalist pirates of journalism, Frederick Boniface was the grandson of Salvatore Bonifacio, a Corsican immigrant who married into the patrician New England family of Alden, A-L-D-E-N, direct descendants of John Alden. His grandson changed the spelling to the more French Boniface, B-O-N-F-I-L-S, and became an insurance agent in the Midwest. He made a small fortune in the Oklahoma land boom, and with this stake, he launched his own business venture, the Little Louisiana Lottery in Kansas City. The purchase of tickets were outraged to find that the lottery paid no prices. William Rockhill Nelson, founder of the Kansas City Star, ran a series of articles exposing Boniface. The result was that Boniface was arrested. Judicial payments to law enforcement officers enabled him to escape with most of his funds. These are bad guys, folks, but they're being protected by everybody, you see. Boniface then went to Denver, where he teamed up with Harry Tammen, a bartender at the Windsor Hotel. Tammen had a profitable sideline selling fake scalps of Sitting Bull and Geronimo to Eastern tenderfoots who wandered into the bar. He also ran dog and pony shows, which he later built into the renowned Sells at Floto Circus. The Sells family was at the time the most famous name in the circus business. The fact that none of the family was connected with Tammen's operation deterred him not at all. Under threats of lawsuit, he finally made an agreement with a distant relative of the Sells family to use the name. After his success with the lottery, Boniface was looking for something more profitable than Tammen's swindles. Tammen informed him that he could buy the Evening Post in Denver for $12,500. Boniface bought it. Taking Tammen in as his partner, they changed the name to the Denver Post and began a freewheeling blackmail operation, which brought them handsome returns. Strangely enough, none of their victims ever attacked them. Although they were both shot and seriously wounded in the post office, the disgruntled governor was a lawyer whom they had hired to sue Governor Charles Thomas over a pardon which Thomas had failed to grant, presumably after having accepted the required investment customary in those matters. The director of National Biography notes that the journalist's operation of the pair became a national issue as the result of the Post part in the Teapot Dome scandal. The DNB relates that after accepting Stack's bribe, Boniface sought even greater awards by approaching Henry or Harry Sinclair with the proposition that the Denver Post would drop any further developments in the story. Sinclair paid Boniface $250,000 with the promise of $750,000 more if the Post refrained from any further Teapot Dome articles. Boniface was not without his distractors among his fellow editors, some of whom saw fit to lay the full details of this arrangement before the convention of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. The ASNE carefully considered the evidence, which was overwhelming. They then declined to act, claiming that the bride had been paid just before the National Code of Ethics had been installed by the association. The Teapot Dome story is still enshrined in our history book, and the greatest scandal in history, although it has become routine for contemporary journalists to award that title to another Moscow show trial. the Watergate scandals. The Democratic Congress lucrative in the opportunity to drag former Republican officials in for the next 8 years and to hammer away at their terrible crimes while the real villains, that is Rockefeller, Hoover, Meyer, and Baruch, snickered in the background. Fall was not sent to prison until 1931, some 7 years after the event. He was convicted of having accepted a bribe from Edward L. Doheny, although in a later trial, Doheny was acquitted of having given him the bribe. Fall lost both his ranch and his reputation. He died a broken man in 1944. The Great Depression, which followed these Moscow show trials in Washington, was the logical outcome of deliberate manipulation of the national government, both the Congress and the federal agencies, by the Senator international speculations. These political show trials provided the ideal smokescreen behind which the manipulators could execute their long-time program of systematic looting and destroying the nation. Always they do this, folks. They put something out in front. They do this all the time. And you've got all your eyes on this area, and they're always over here doing something else. Nothing changes because most people are dumb. They don't see it. During those golden years of the conspirators, J. Edward Hoover flourished in Washington. He was the only bureaucrat who could provide a corps of political police for any purpose, providing that the customer had sufficient money and political clout. Hoover had come into office as a personal protege of a dedicated liberal activist who had single-handedly eliminated the governor's counterattack against communism in America. Hoover's also remained loyal to his mentor. He found an able accomplice in his strange desires when he hired an up-and-coming young Washington called Clyde Tolson, T-O-L-S-O-N, as his assistant. Like Hoover, Tolson had also been the protege of a powerful Washington official, former Secretary of War Newton D. Baker. As a confidential secretary to Baker, Tolson's duties had never been obvious, but the association was a satisfying one. After Baker's departure from Washington, Tolson followed Hoover's advice and went to night school and attained his law degree as Hoover had done. Like Hoover, Tolson was also a dedicated Mason, active in the Washington Lodge, that is. In his entire career, Hoover accepted only one business directorship as director of the influential and wealthy Masonic insurance company called Acadia, A-C-A-C-I-A, Mutual Insurance. Hoover's rise to power in the Bureau of Investigation was preceded by his becoming more and more active in Masonic endeavors. On November 9, 1920, he was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason in Federal Lodge Number 1. In April 1921, he attained the various degrees in the Royal Arch Masons in July of 1921. He joined the Washington Commandery Number 1. He was then named Assistant Director of the Bureau of Investigation, October 22, 1921. On March 1, 1922, J. Edward Hoover joined the Alamos Shrine Temple, and a few weeks later, he was given a commission as captain in the U.S. Army Intelligence. In the Royal Masonic Encyclopedia, Kenneth McKenzie defines the Acadia as the symbolic plant of Freemasonry. The Acadia, known as Jebbet, J-E-B-B-E-C-K, in Egypt, flourishes in the Levantin countries, L-E-V-A-N-T-I-N countries. It was the sacred wood of the Jews called Shintak, S-H-I-T, Shitak, S-H-I-T-T-A-H. The Acadia was used to indicate the place where dead bodies had been interned among the Jews. William Sullivan later stated in his revealing book about the FBI called The Bureau, but for reasons they were never entirely clear, Tolson rose quickly and was soon working as a director's side. Sullivan, that is, also commented that Tolson's sole duty at the FBI seemed to be to agree with whatever Hoover proposed. If Sullivan had intended to, in later writings, to make the reasons for Tolson's rise to power in the FBI more clear, he was not to have the opportunity. He was shot in a hunting accident. By steadily building important political alliances in Washington, J. Edward Hoover cultivated close relationships with the nation's leading gangsters. He ignored ordinary criminals while consorting with family heads of the National Crime Syndicate. In a revealing work, Secret File, by Henry Mezek, states in page 197. Reinfeld had headed the Reinfeld Syndicate during the great days of the Big Seven in partnership with the Brockman Brothers in Canada, and Longet Swillman, that's Swillman, the Al Capone of New Jersey. Much of the liquor bought to the East Coast was transported there by the Reinfeld, that's Reinfeld syndicate. On page 277, Messick said the Reinfeld syndicate was divided in two parts. The Canadian end was headed by the four Brockman brothers, Samuel, Abe, Harry, and Alan. They began as owners of a small hotel and ended as the richest men in Canada and head of distillers Seagram. That's right, Seagram, ginger ale people. It was the Brockmans' duty to buy Canadian booze and ship it around the East Coast to the rum rows, Boston and New York. What was J. Edward Hoover part of it in all this? He began to receive substantial donations from the mobsters and set up a private holding operation, the J. Edward Hoover Foundation, as conduit for the monies. He detailed his personal publicity agent as the FBI, Louis Nichols, who later named his son after J. Edward, who head the foundation. Nichols became the confidential assistant to the notorious Lew L.E.W. Rosenstiel, a bootlegger who became head of the Schegelen Corporation, Schenley Corporation. In this capacity, Lew Nichols was installed in Washington as the highest paid lobbyist for the ex-bootleggers who were now respectable liquor distillers, thanks to FDR's successful repeal program. Nichols used his Capitol Hill contracts, which he had developed during his years as J. Edward Hoover's right-hand man at the FBI, to save the liquor mongols many millions of dollars in taxes. So let me just explain something right here. Those who passed the amendment that to prevent people from drinking, to make the country dry, that was done on purpose. They used the women in order to do this, to bring about all this, so that the other people would rise in power, which they didn't have it before. Now were illegitimate boozemans and selling liquor on the side, so to speak. And what happened was once this eventually opens back up, they repeal the amendment. They repeal the amendment. Then what they do simply is now they're the big boys in liquor, and yet they would go after bootleggers that were really small time and destroy them. And he acquired large estates in Virginia and New Jersey as the result of loyalty to the liquor kings. In 1958, Nichols was successful in lobbying an excise tax bill through Congress, which saved Seneca Corporation $50 million in taxes. He sponsored the 4N bill, which extended the storage period for whiskey from 8 to 20 years. As soon as this bill was passed, the value of Seneca stock increased 67% in value. Drew Pearson, the Washington scandal monger who had become one of the co-conspirators of the J. Edward Hoover Foundation, recorded many items in his diary which he never published in his daily columns. He made an observation daily, dated July 18, 1949, about a syndicate operator, Bill Heislis, H-E-L-I-S, who had purchased the Tanforan racetrack from Joe Reinfeld, the head of the syndicate. Now, I understand that why Bill Heislis contributed $3,000 to J. Edward Hoover Foundation. He was a front for Reinfeld. On June 17, 1948, Pearson made an entry as follows. Truman, president, complained about J. Edward Hoover collecting gossip. He was particularly sore about FBI's report on David Niles about a love affair. The love affair concerned Niles' perverted activities. He was a notorious homosexual, an alcoholic, and a communist agent. One of Niles' sisters worked at KGB headquarters in Moscow. Another of his sisters worked in the headquarters of the Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad, in Tel Aviv. Niles boasted that he had all bases covered. To punish J. Edward Hoover for having kept Niles under surveillance, Truman demanded that he furnish 2 FBI agents to accompany Niles each evening on his homosexual forays around Washington. While Niles worked a Bury truck driver into an alley, the agent had to crouch behind garbage cans, remain concealed until Niles had completed his work. If the truck driver threatened to rob him or beat him up, the FBI agents then rushed forward to protect him. Unbeknownst to Truman, his closest crony, that is, General Harry Vaughn, was actually J. Edward Hoover's personal agent in the White House. Not only did General Vaughn report personally to Hoover every day on what was being said and done in the White House, he also lobbied to advance Hoover's power, working with great fervor to persuade Truman to place the OSS and later the CIA under Hoover's control. Despite his great influence with the president, Vaughn was unable to persuade Truman to grant Hoover these concessions. In return for his valuable assistance, Hoover funneled expensive gifts to General Vaughn from his wealthy contacts in the syndicate. On November 23, 1949, Pearson noted in his diary that he had a phone call from J. Edward Hoover demanding that he kill a story about the White House employee or go to jail. I told Edgar he was nuts. Hoover said Steve Early made him do it. When Clyde Tolson had his side, J. Edward Hoover had long been a regular visitor to the more lavish syndicate vacation spas. The couple were a winter regulars at the notorious Florida headquarters of the syndicate. That's right, folks. J. Myers Schutz Roni Plaza Hotel in Miami. On the West Coast, they will wine and dine at Del Mar Racetrack because of syndicate connections. In return for these favors, J. Edward Hoover held national press conferences each year, during which he routinely denied that there was such an entity as a national crime syndicate. In response to an inquiry from Assistant Attorney General Theron Caudell, who later attained national fame as Mint Caudy for his role in payoff schemes, J. Edward Hoover wrote Caudy a personal memorandum that is dated October 13, 1948. Please be advised that the search of the records of this bureau fails to reflect that Zillman has ever been the subject of investigation conducted by the FBI. At that time, Zillman was reputed to be the number 2 man in the National Crime Syndicate. In the fall of 1958, 10 years later, according to Victor Navsky in his book Kennedy Justed, 52 numbered copies of the FBI report on the Mafia, apparently prepared without J. Edward Hoover's acknowledgement or consent, were distributed to 25 top officials in the government who were directly concerned with law enforcement. This was the first time that the FBI had officially recognized the existence of a national crime syndicate. When he learned of the report the day after it had been distributed, J. Edward Hoover was furious. He immediately had each copy of the report recalled and destroyed. He denounced the report as baloney. It was never mentioned again. Wow. Wow. In the mid-1930s, J. Edward Hoover embarked upon a massive public relations campaign, portraying himself as a fearless crime fighter wielding a machine gun as he mowed down the criminals. In fact, he had never fired a gun at anyone during his career, nor did he do so at any later time until his death. Pressure from opponents on Capitol Hill at that time, he had not yet attained his later ascension over Congress, forced him to become more involved in criminal matters. Longtime friends of Senator Burton Wheeler and Tom Walsh had vowed to get Hoover because of his illegal use of FBI agents in a frenetic campaign to have these senators indicted on charges of taking bribes. Their friends made impassioned speeches on the floor of the Senate, not only denying the charges against them, but also making pointed comments about Hoover's lack of personal experience in the field of law enforcement. Although they avoided direct charges that Hoover was operating a political police force in the United States, one critic noted that it was a matter of record that Hoover had never participated in arrests during his entire career. Stung by this criticism and facing a possible widespread demand on Capitol Hill for his removal, Hoover notified his agents that they should delay the arrest of any prominent criminal, his famous public enemy category, until he was summoned to arrive on the scene. A few weeks later, he received a wire from New Orleans that FBI agents there had trapped Alvin KNRPIS Knight's public enemy number 1. Hoover flew to New Orleans, where his agents assured him that Knight's had indeed been secured. Hoover rushed up to the back stairs and burst into the room. Knight's was already summoned by the FBI agents who had disarmed him. Hoover tried to put the handcuffs on him and was informed that no one had remembered to bring them. One agent whipped off his necktie, and the most dangerous man in America was hustled out to the car, his hands secured by an ordinary necktie. Hoover realized that Karpus could make the story of his arrest as a matter of public record if he was ever released from prison. The director notified the Bureau of Prisons that under no circumstances was Karpus ever to be given parole. The result was that embittered Karpus spent much of his rest of his life in prison. When he was finally released, he did write a book in which he referred to the director in unprintable terms, describing both his reputable racial origins and his sexual habits. President Franklin D. Roosevelt considered Hoover's personal life a matter of great amusement. Roosevelt himself, despite his crippled condition, was inveterated heterosexual. He often regaled his dinner guests with comments on Hoover's personal life. After one of these dinners, the British ambassador noted in his memorandum to the House Office in 1938, FDR fancies himself the reincarnation of the Byzantine emperor. In keeping with this image, he has placed a unit in charge of his household, as Hoover's FBI is principally concerned with keeping the government employees in rein. Some of the most daring congressmen on Capitol Hill were no less scattering in their reference to the director, Representative John Rankin of Mississippi, who was well known for his iconoclastic remarks both on and off the record, incurred Hoover's wrath by a pointed reference to requests for huge increases in annual FBI appropriation bill. Speaking on the floor of the House, Rankin and quote, "A lot of these statistics sound like fairy tales to me." Administrator after administration came and went in Washington. Hoover remained imperturbable, fixed in his seat of power, seemingly impregnable to the changing moods of the voters. At the beginning of each new administration, there was loud demands for his removal from office. One of the most voracious of President Truman's left-wing aides, Max Logenthal, rushed into Truman's office shortly after the demise of FDR. "Whatever priors you may have lined up, Mr. President," he said, "you must realize that at the earliest possible moment, you should remove J. Edward Hoover from the FBI, replacing him with someone more amenable to our democratic program. And you certainly must be aware of his proclivities." Truman listened without comments. Weeks went by and he took no action. Logenthal had failed to realize that Hoover's impregnable position rested not only on the famed black cabinet, a file of photos and telephone tape recordings, and congressional sexual peccadillos and filing maneuvering, but also on the fact that J. Edward Hoover was one of the nation's most powerful Masons. Truman himself owed his entire political career to the years he had put in as chief Masonic organizer for the state of Missouri. So it's not going to happen. Hoover's companion, that is, Clyde Tolson, was also a high-ranking Mason. Truman ignored Logenthal's demand. Logenthal then wrote a book denouncing Hoover and the FBI primarily because of his supposed anti-communist activities. Like most liberals in the United States, Logenthal had accepted without question the public relations campaign, which portrayed J. Edward Hoover not only as the greatest crime fighter in the nation, but also as the most active anti-communist. This was the first of a succession of books on the FBI by Washington professional liberals. All of them ignored the true basis of his power, his Masonic affiliation. Logenthal would never have believed that it was Hoover and his mentor, Harlan Stone, who had successfully sabotaged the national campaign against communism in 1924. This movement laid morbid until Senator Joe McCarthy revived it briefly in the 1950s. Like his forerunner in this movement, McCarthy was hounded until he died in disgrace, having been officially recommended by the Senate of the United States for having dared to oppose the Communist Party in this country. Although President Truman officially ignored Logenthal's book, his personal assistant, David Niles, wrote him a glowing letter. "You're doing a wonderful service to the country by writing a book of this sort," even if he had been sincere in his opposition to communism. J. Edward Hoover would have had to accept the fact that the new administration in 1933 consisted of a Democratic Party which had been captured by the fanatic Stalinist wing of the world communist movement. Not only did Roosevelt come into office with a prepared agreement to officially recognize the Soviet government of Russia. That's right, folks. He was the first to recognize the Soviet government. How dare you? He also surrounded himself with dedicated communist espionage agents. His three closest confidants were Alger Hiss, that's a bad one, later sent to prison for lying about his activities on behalf of the communists. Lanchan Currie, C-U-R-R-I-E, was named by Elizabeth Bentley and other ex-communists in testimony before Congress as a communist agent, and Harry Dexter White, personal assistant to Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau. You know who he is, don't you? The Morgenthau Plan. You know the plan that divided Germany up, and then I guess probably 35% of Germany, if not quite a little bit more, went to the East Germans, which were a communist country, and then the rest were partitioned by three countries: France, Britain, and the United States. Who shipped the U.S. plates for printing American occupation currency in Germany to the Soviet Union. You hear that? Let's say that again. The Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau and the Roosevelt administration who shipped the U.S. plates for printing American occupation currency in Germany to the Soviet Union. The Soviets ran off some $35 billion in U.S. occupation marks, which enabled them to pay the cost of their occupation of Germany. Doesn't hurt to have friends in high places, does it? All of these marks were later paid for by American taxpayers, as usual. Hoover files bulge with documented information about the communist activities of many leading members of the Roosevelt administration, most of which he prudently kept under wraps. Roosevelt understood the situation and knew that Hoover, as an accomplished bureaucrat, would do nothing as long as the Democrats were in power. During the Second World War, General Wild Bill Donovan, anxious to please Roosevelt, staffed the new Office of Strategic Service, now is called the CIA, with many known communist agents. To needle his rival, Hoover sent to Donovan some of the most damaging dossiers about his closest lieutenant in the OSS. Donovan reported the plot to Roosevelt with the wry comment of course I knew they were communists. That's why I hired them. As a SOP to the Stalins who controlled Washington, J. Edward Hoover hired none other than the founder of the Communist Party of the United States, J. Liebenstein, or Lovestone, as the ghostwriter for his projected book on communism. The resulting book was artificial title Master of Deceit, perhaps as a joke on Hoover. Lovestone had included in the book a complete communist manual for operating local chapters of the Communist Party throughout the United States. Hoover apparently remained unaware of the deception, probably because he never read it. He was content to collect the considerable sums which the book, immediately bestseller, brought into his bank account. All the expenses, including Lovestone's fee, had been paid from FBI Special Information Funds. J. Edward Hoover's famed state of chronic paranoia was not due to the fact that he suspected people around him of being communists or Nazis. He was always suspicious that they might use their position to amass information which would help his enemies to get rid of him. His magnanimous line of protection against this much wished for event was his black cabinet of incriminating information on the leading political figures in Washington. Only his longtime personal secretary, that is, Helen Gandy, had access to it. Jack Anderson and other Washington journalists might boast that they could gain access to any FBI files in Hoover's headquarters by offering favors or discreet payment, but none of them could get to the material in the black cabinet. When a new president came into office, J. Edward Hoover always made a point of sending him over some of the choicest tidbits about his political rivals. The president would be made aware that if Hoover had some information on others, he probably had equally damaging information on the present incumbent. The ploy served both as an offer of integration and as a warning. Post-war presidents, that is, Lyndon Johnson probably appreciated these tidbits more than anyone. Known to his political intimates in Texas as Dry Gulch Lyndon, because of the fate of those who threatened his political rise. His personality was closely related to that of the director himself, totally dedicated to greed, lust, and power. Having secured the White House and Capitol Hill, J. Edward Hoover was now free to indulge in his inordinate appetite for luxury. He and Clyde Tolson continued to be wined and dined by the nation's crime leaders. A 1957 cover story on Hoover by Time magazine noted that when he and Tolson went to New York, they were usually met at the reserved table of the Stork Club by none other than Frank Costello, the acknowledged head of the National Crime Syndicate. While Hoover was in Washington, the columnist Walter Winchell served as the official courier between Hoover and the mafia. If a particular family was causing law enforcement problems anywhere in the United States, Winchell would arrange for a family member to meet with Hoover at the Stork Club, with the gregarious Costello sitting in as a referee, and the problem would be ironed out in a convivial matter. J. Edward Hoover developed a small circle of multi-million patrons who cemented their friendship by showing him with expensive gifts. Hoover expected nothing less than solid gold cufflinks, sterling silver candelabras, and rare oriental carvings of precious jade. At Christmas, the unofficial president of J. Edward Hoover's fan club, that is Lewis March, would deliver to Hoover expensive train sets and other high-priced items from the March Toy Company, which Hoover, as Santa Claus, would then pass out to the children of the FBI employees. March had profited greatly from the looting of conquered Germany. His firm took many intricate toy patents from German manufacturers and reproduced them profitably in the United States. FBI agents were expected to favor Hoover with expensive gifts. One agent borrowed money to have a Persian rug custom made for the boss with the initials JEH, woman in the center. This agent later enjoyed a meteoric career for the FBI. Hoover launched the practice of an annual birthday party at his office, at which the agents who received modest salaries were expected to present him with solid gold or sterling silver gifts. No one was compelled to do so, but these agents who ignored the festivities were sometimes transferred to Boise, Idaho, the legendary Siberia of the FBI. Although no one ever dared to fire a shot at Hoover during his legendary career, he maintained at government's expense, that is $30,000 each, a fleet of 5 heavily armor-plated limousines. 2 were kept in Washington, 1 in Miami, 1 in New York, and 1 in Los Angeles. Hoover frequently circulated photos of himself brandishing a machine gun, although he had never been known to fire except on a firing range. J. Edward Hoover guided existence could suddenly, when he was found dead in bed by his longtime housekeeper, Anna Frills. This unexpected event, he had no previous health problems, was linked by Washington insiders to the Watergate scandal, which was then at its height. A FBI agent in Mexico City had come up with some photos with direct link top officials in Washington with the inner operations of CREEP, C-R-E-E-P, President Nixon's confidential re-election team. Someone apparently decided that Hoover could only be prevented from using these photos for his own advantage, that is, by offering them to the highest bidder, by bringing a halt to his long career. This was done. J. Edward Hoover's last will and testament did little to dispel the Capitol Hill rumors and ribald comments at the National Press Club about his personal life. He seemed to confirm long-time conjectures by resolutely cutting off his relatives in his will and leaving his entire estate with the exception of a few bequests to other associates to his consort, Clyde Tolson. Tolson was also named executor of the will. $5,000 was left to his secretary, Helen Ganty, $3,000 to his housekeeper, Anna Franks, and $2,000 to his chauffeur, James Crawford. The millions of dollars worth of gifts which Hoover had received over the years was appraised at a fraction of, were appraised at a fraction of their value. His important collection, Oriole J, said to be worth more than $1 million, was listed at a few $1,000s. In the published list of the appraisals of hundreds of items from his estate, we find that Hoover's personal gold FBI shield listed at $5. A collector would probably pay $1,500 for it. Hoover's leather billfold with the Department of Justice seal set with 13 diamonds was listed at $50. This would probably bring $3,000 at auction. A jaded phoenix bird on stand was listed at $35. This would be a $1,000 item. The appraisal, which was duly notarized by Clyde Tolson as a true and perfect inventory, listed a collection of 1,000 books, most of which had been autographed by the author to J. Edward Hoover at $1 each. The collection included books by a number of presidents, from Herbert Hoover to Richard Nixon, and from many other prominent figures. The autograph value alone, there would be worth hundreds of dollars each. Dozens of sterling silver items were listed at $5 or $10 each. 2 sterling silver candelabras were listed at $16 for the pair. These would probably bring $350. 52 pieces of Masonic flatware, Royal Arch Mason, patterned heavy sterling silver were listed at $166 for the lot. 4 yellow gold Masonic rings, 1 with diamond, were listed at $80 for the lot. Even at these deflated prices, Tolson inherited more than $500,000 from J. Edward Hoover. Hoover's successor, FBI actor director J. L. Patrick Gray III, Annapolis graduate, admitted burning many of FBI documents. Hoover's secretary, Helen Ganty, appeared before a special congressional committee to confess that she had shredded Hoover's secret files. Wow. The contents of the dreaded Black Cabinet. Instead of having her tried on criminal charges, as was later done with Colonel Oliver North, the congressman greatly relieved all but commended her for a job well done. Wow. The Washington Post on January 19, 1975 carried a lengthy story that she had given 12 file cabinet drawers of particular sensitive files to Assistant Director FBI W. Mark Fell, who was rumored to be the deep throat informant of the Watergate massacre. Despite the documented testimony, the New York Times carried a story from its huge Washington bureau, February 9, 1975, that the unconfirmed reports claimed that Mr. Hoover's friends removed or destroyed the files in the hours before Mr. Graves took office. Apparently, the Times Washington bureau never read the Washington Post. Basking in the heartfelt approval of the congressional investigation, Helen Grandin retired to Florida. She died of cancer in an Orange City nursing home July 7, 1988, at the age of 91, leaving no survivors. Clyde Tolson died April 14, 1975. The Washington Post printed a post with his obituary, which turned out to be a photo of Lewis Nichols. The error was corrected on April 16th. Like his friend J. Edward Hoover, Clyde Tolson also disinherited all of his relatives. The Washington Post commented that the Tolson will, disposing of some $540,000 worth, that is in 1975, represented the Hoover's bequest. Tolson left $200,000 to other Hoover cronies, another $4,000 to Helen Grantey. Tolson's secretaries, Dorothy Stillman, received $27,000. Number 3 man in the FBI, John Moore, was named executive. He received $26,000. Hoover's former employees, Anna Fields and James Crawford, received $32,000 each. One might conjecture that these requests, which deliberately cut off Tolson's relatives in favor of Hoover's cronies, would be considered a tribute to the late director's memory. They might also be considered a reward for continual discretion. A further imbroglio developed when Moore's attempt to carry out Tolson's bequest of J. Edward Hoover's memorandum to the J. Edward Hoover room in the new FBI building. The problem was that there was no J. Edward Hoover room in the new FBI building, nor was there likely to be, due to the spirited opposition on Capitol Hill. A few Hoover mementos, that is, were on display in one area of the guided tour, but officials were wary of setting up a special room J. Edward Hoover's memory. Disturbing rumors about his personal life were still circulating throughout the city, and considerable opposition had been voiced by congressmen, media personalities, and other spokesmen. They feared that at the moment a national news story might break, which would dominate the rumors about Hoover's personal life, this might necessitate renaming the building and declaring J. Edward Hoover a non-person in the deceptive Stalinist style. The present writer had already filed a lawsuit against the estate of J. Edward Hoover and the possibility of a court hearing and the presentation of witnesses and documented evidence caused some congressmen to demand that the new FBI building should not bear J. Edward Hoover's name. The media cooperated in banning all further mention of my lawsuit, while the United States court system closed ranks to prevent any trial of that action. He was quietly dismissed with no evidence, no witnesses, nor this writer ever being permitted to enter the courtroom. Justice, the Department of Justice, that is, has been served. The only living person who had dared to oppose J. Edward Hoover at the FBI had been given the bum rush by Hoover's when Sullivan, who had long been the number 2 man at the FBI, finally summoned up the courage to ask Hoover just when he planned to retire and relinquish his position to Sullivan. For 8 consecutive years, Hoover had made a solemn pledge to Sullivan at the beginning of each year that this would be his last year at the FBI, and that his only desire was to retire and live quietly at home with his pet dogs. The morning after Sullivan delivered what amounted to an ultimatum to Hoover, he arrived at FBI headquarters to find that the locks had been changed on his door. His parking space and secretary were gone. His personal effects were later delivered to him by a flunky. Sullivan later wrote a revealing book about the boss, which was published under the title The Bureau. It skirted many important issues, which Sullivan had planned to treat in a later and more startling book. Sullivan had been Hoover's personal choice for the director of controversial COINTELPRO program, a campaign of unparalleled hatred and vindication against targets chosen by Hoover himself, including the present writer. In 1977, the Sullivan was to be subpoenaed after COINTELPRO operation, which included many illegal acts, including political conspiracy, black bag jobs, or burglars, the manufacture of phony evidence, and stories planned to harass innocent victims, illegal wiretaps, seizure of mail, and many other crimes which had led to a great suffering and other deaths of the victims. Many details of the COINTELPRO operations were contained in some 52,000 pages of FBI files, which had been obtained by the Citizen Investigation Bureau of Ohio through the Freedom of Information Act. Shortly before he was due to testify by the COINTELPRO, Sullivan was shot and killed in a mysterious hunting accident. Wow. He was shot in an open field in broad daylight, ostensibly by the son of a law enforcement officer, while wearing bright red safety hunting clothes. The accident occurred when a shot was fired from a high-powered rifle using a telescope sight. It had all the manifestation of a professional hit job, but the FBI resolutely resisted all demands for an official investigation into the death of his former number 2 official, claiming that it was a local matter. Wow. Hoover's successor, L. Patrick Gray III, hurried to camp when the present writer filed suit against Hoover's estate. He was replaced by former FBI agent Clarence Kelly, who was then serving as the police chief of Kansas City. That is, and Kansas City was a notorious mafia-controlled city, yet Kelly's wife refused to move to Washington, claiming that the city had too high a crime rate. It was only a fraction of the present rate, which had won Washington the title of murder capital of the year, of the world. Kelly had to go home to Kansas City every weekend, leaving the running of the FBI to Hoover's longtime cronies. The Bureau was then presented to a federal judge with liberal credentials. William Webster, the present writer, also sued for 33 years of harassment and surveillance. Webster was moved to the CIA and replaced by another judge, a Texas protege named Senator John Tower. William Sessions. He has also been known as the absentee director, spending most of his time traveling around the United States and visiting field offices. The FBI was run into absence by one of the old crowd, Assistant Director Buck Revell. Oliver Buck Revell, one of the FBI's old guard, had been in line for the position of director when Webster left for the CIA. He had developed a close relationship with Oliver North. When the Iran-Contra story broke in Washington, Revell was deemed to be too compromised by this relationship and was passed over in favor of Sessions. After repeated criticism of Sessions as an absentee director and newspaper stories that Revell was actually running the FBI, Sessions hurriedly named a new assistant director and suggested that Revell should retire. And that's the conclusion of chapter 9 here from Eustace Mullins' book here, talking about the rape of justice. That is chapter 9. And the title being The Case of the Strange Director. And those stories are true, folks. Hoover was a homosexual, indeed. So we're going to stop here. It's a little after 7 o'clock. Appreciate you guys being here. Appreciate your comments. And we'll be hopefully sharing more books in the near future. And like I said here, The Other Losses is one book I'll be dealing with. Again, the particular book that I am actually sharing from is this book here, The Rape of Justice, chapter 9, by whoever else you know, Eustace Mullins. So thank you, and have a good night.